All right. Well, hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 358th New Social Environment. I'm Nick Bennett, the Special Projects Editor here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation with Antwaun Sargent and Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky. We're thrilled to have the poet Lucía Hinojosa Gaxiola here, who will read to close today's program. Just a few quick notes before we get started. The Rail team will be helping out with tech if you have any questions. Closed captions are available by pressing the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. We've started all of our events with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in New York, we are on Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second is an acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. The heart of both of these acknowledgements is a commitment to the liberation of the oppressed and solidarity for all who struggle for freedom, and recognition that when it comes to liberation, our histories never unfold in isolation, as spoken by the great Angela Davis. In that spirit, I encourage you all to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions that will be posted in just a moment. But now to introduce today's guest and host. Writer, curator, and critic Antwaun Sargent is the author of the new Black Vanguard, Photography Between Art and Fashion, and a director at Gagosian. His first show at the gallery is Social Works, currently on view. Please note summer hours if you plan on visiting. Our host today is composer, multimedia artist, and writer Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky, who immerses audiences in a blend of genres, global culture, and environmental and social issues. Miller has collaborated with an array of recording artists, including Metallica, Chuck D, Steve Reich, and Yoko Ono. He is an editor at large for the Brooklyn Rail. And without further ado, Paul, handing the mic over to you.
Yeah, hey, first and foremost, I just want to say thanks everybody for joining us. It's a beautiful summer day here in New York, and considering the pandemic is like raging and the whole Delta variant is really switching things up on everybody. Just want to say, everybody, hope you're fully vaccinated and safe and sound. Antwaun, I just want to say thank you for making the time. I know everybody's hectic, and yeah, it's one of those kind of moments. So just to jump in, one of the things that really appeals to me about the way that you're thinking is you have this kind of interdisciplinary approach to how you've been putting together both your writing, your approach to art, and above all, this kind of idea of like kind of a lyrical inheritance of what I view as sort of a Joseph Boysian approach to social sculpture, like pulling together radically unexpected elements. And of course, with an African-American context. I just want to ask you, like, just as a start, can you give us a little bit of your background about where you grew up and how that affected your thinking? I mean, because I think a lot of times we focus on ideas, but I'm very intrigued to hear like your backstory.
For sure. Thank you guys for having me. And I'm happy to join the Brooklyn Rail community this afternoon and be in conversation with you, Paul, about, social works, but also sort of more broadly about artistic production. I grew up in Chicago, and I think that growing up in Chicago and having access to world-class institutions, museums like the Art Institute of Chicago, the MCA, but then also, other institutions like the Chicago Youth Symphony and the Field Museum, and and having all of that sort of be a part of my sort of cultural upbringing was really important. And I think that I went to school in DC, I went to Georgetown, and I studied at a School of Foreign Service, Culture and Politics, and really sort of just being exposed to sort of the museums there and sort of really fantastic philosophers, and having great professors like Leslie Hinkson, for example, really sort of helped to sort of shape my engagement and outlook with sort of culture and Black, artistic production in particular, and sort of think about that from always a communal sort of standpoint, right? I think that most of the exhibitions and projects that I've done has been trying to sort of synthesize different ways that Black artists and cultural producers like writers and curators are thinking about sort of what we call contemporary art, and which is to say is the socio and political moments that we have experienced, that we will experience, that we're in now, and how artists and cultural workers are responding to and trying to make sense of those moments, past and present.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I mean, I remember reading that you had gone to Georgetown. I grew up in DC. I don't know if you ever went to a spot called Teaism on Connecticut and Arm.
Yes.
Right. That's literally my old family's building. So I grew up right there. That's my
Oh, wow.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and Kramer Books, their family, my family, friends. That was like the late night hangout spot.
Spent a lot of time at Kramer Books, actually.
I was like, I was just guessing, like P Street Books, Kramer Books, poets. You know, there's a whole bunch of different kind of scene. Because Kramer, if anybody in the audience knows DC, DuPont Circle, there's a kind of a connection to both Georgetown and Howard, because it's a couple different universities converge there. So let's dial into the show that's going on, because I'm really intrigued. Currently, you have a wonderful exhibition at Gagosian called Social Works. And one of the things that really struck me, whether it was David Adjay or Carrie Mae Weems, many of my Theaster, these are all great people. What was some of the common threads that pulled them together? Because they're all doing very different works. Obviously, David's architecture, Theaster has an architectural resonance. Carrie has some relationship to thinking about social process and more individuation, because she does a lot of kind of I view her as like more almost like she's always dealing with some of her own personal histories with relationship to space when she goes to different exhibitions as photography and so on. What, just like, can you walk us through some of the connecting threads? Because you also are into fashion as well. So I'm going to dial into that in a little bit, but what would you say is a common theme there?
I mean, I think you just hit on it. I mean, I think that, yes, you have, these artists working sort of in different disciplines, across disciplines, but they're all sort of thinking about the relationship to space. They're thinking about their relationship to community. They're thinking about their relationships to the communities in which they are firmly rooted in, right? And so you talked about Carrie Mae Weems in the exhibition, her work, Roaming in a Museum series, is sort of thinking literally about sort of architectures of power and juxtaposing her own body, her own subjectivity to and against those spaces, right? And so, in the Roaming series, she's sort of, in the works that we have in the gallery, she's in Rome after, or during a residency at the Royal Academy, and she's sort of thinking about sort of the relationship between her body and sort of public space, right? And then in the museum series, one of which you see now, which is there in the middle, you have Carrie Mae Weems standing outside of the British Museum, right? Sort of in this black dress, sort of asking us all to think about our relationships through her, right? To these institutions, right? Who they've let in, who they've kept out, what are the history of their acquisitions, what are the ways in which to engage different communities or don't engage different communities. What should you feel when you enter an institution like the British Museum, given its architectural sort of mandate, right? And so I think that those sort of questions also reverberate throughout the exhibition, in different sort of dynamic ways. One of the things that I wanted to do with this show was to sort of show the ways that these artists, being artists, creative people, are thinking about these notions in their own ways, right? And so with someone like Linda Goodbrien, who you had the slide before, if we can go back to that, it'd be great. Linda is someone who is in a lot of ways a connective tissue, right? You talk about sort of Joseph Beuys, sort of thinking about social practice in the 70s, and Linda was also thinking about sort of the gathering of, Black folks in New York City through just above Midtown, right? And so I think you have sort of different histories of social practice that I wanted to sort of hone in on, particularly, not necessarily thinking about boys, but, thinking about the way that Black cultural producers had worked in that space. And, Linda is a great example, giving Just Above Midtown, which is the gallery she started in 1974, showed folks like David Hammond and Singing Agudi, among others, Suzanne Jackson. And then she, in that work, she's sort of thinking about how do you make spaces, art, right, out of spaces with real life consequences, right? And so, as a sort of gallerist and then filmmaker, and more recently, the founder of Project Eats, which she founded in 2009, which is, a series of several, I believe, 13 state urban farms operated by Linda's organization that really is about sort of making sure that folks have fresh produce access. And in the space of the gallery, Linda and Liz Diller came together to realize a living garden, hanging from the skylight, that responds to the architecture of the building, right? And what's really one of the really cool things that I think happens across the exhibition is that Linda team come in and actually harvest this garden, and the food is given away on the wall, and is there for visitors to take with them to eat. And so the exhibition becomes literally a part of the viewer in that way, right? And so I think that that's, just, only two examples. You talked about Theaster and David's work, them thinking about sort of so Theaster's thinking about sort of the archive, the musical archive, and the psychic possibilities of the musical archive in Frankie Knuckles' records, 5,000 personal records he played in clubs. And we sort of have that work there, and in the space of the exhibition, because again, we're sort of thinking about community, we're thinking about space making. The records are being digitized, making a digital archive, digital space in that gallery, through as the exhibition runs. And so, we're thinking sort of with these artists. I got to think very dynamically about sort of the way that we sort of approach space, the way we create space, and in those spaces, with the way that we create community. And, with David's work, monumental large scale sculpture that he made from the literal earth that we walk on in New York State, which is called, which is also referred to as limestone, right? And so he's sort of working with a foundry in upstate New York, 60 tons of limestone, sort of crushed it and rammed it into this sculpture. And one of the sort of really amazing things about this work, and David has worked this way, over the last several years, thinking about the earth as a possibility from which to build from. What's one of the really amazing things that it sucks in carbon out of the air, this sculpture of David, because it's a living monument in that way. And so it oxidizes the air. And so, it really is about sort of, what you see before you, but also the ways in which these different works are functioning even beyond sort of what the eye can see.
No, so what's beautiful about what you've done, and I have to admit, I see a lot of art, and I'm sure many people in the audience do as well, is that these are people that are from radically different approaches. I mean, David, obviously, there's a very famous phrase from Goethe where he says, architecture is nothing but frozen music. Mm-hmm. And to me, at least, if we remix that phrase and say, music is nothing but liquid architecture, there's a fun sensibility about the way that you dealt with both Frankie Knuckles' record collection right next to David's sculpture, which I always found very charming. And Frankie Knuckles, for those in the audience who aren't aware, house music obviously is one of the main critical components of global culture right now. Exactly. And if you think about Detroit minimalism, there's also Carl Craig, he just had an exhibition at Dia Center recently. So these are all I think there's a moment in the culture right now where after like this pandemic moment, where people are really getting a plateau view of the possibilities and potentialities of progressive Black culture, which I think your show really just hit it right on the nail. Do you feel, I mean, how do you, I mean, let's talk about some of the, because you were talking about the legacies and histories of both some of the galleries that helped set up artists like David Hammond. So he has a wonderful piece, if the audience hasn't seen it yet, across from the Whitney Museum, where it's just a kind of an outline of a building in silver. It's just stunningly beautiful. I go jogging near there all the time. But you know, it's kind of like your show for the summer, at least, is really giving, I think, a lot of, how should I put this, new perspectives on potentiality. And that's where I think the juxtaposition of an architect like David or someone like Theaster, who also celebrates community and neighborhood. These are things that, for lack of a better word, allow us to kind of look at an indexical relationships, because people are collecting, they're also being able to really revitalize the materials they're gathering. And that's what I think your show is kind of, how should I put it, maybe catalyze that. Do you feel, I mean, let's talk about fashion for a second, because you have a recent book, a wonderful book on the history of photography and African-American fashion as well. But do you want to unpack the book in relationship to this, or maybe that we can do that in a different angle? Your call.
I don't know if, again, I think I sort of, I think about my sort of work as having a practice, and I think that this sort of the work that I do at the gallery is a part of that practice. The work that I do with young photographers with the new Black Vanguard is a part of that practice, I think that, sort of my writing for publications is a part of that practice. I think it all sort of thinks of, again, is rooted in this exploration of Blackness, of Black communities, of Black identities, right? And so I think with, the new Black Vanguard, what was important about that particular project, and for those who don't know, in 2019, it hasn't even been 2 years, but in 2019, October 2019, Aperture published a book, and I curated an exhibition alongside the book that's currently traveling around the world right now. It is at the Arles Photo Festival. It will travel for the next several years and across the America and Europe. And that sort of exhibition focused on young photographers, Black photographers working around the world throughout the African diaspora, thinking about sort of their relationships to beauty, identity, and desire through photography. And I think that it's a very, different project, given that it's a photo, based project. But I do think that it is, again, about sort of a younger Black generation thinking about themselves in terms of the way they want to be imaged and heard and seen. I thought frankly, I just thought it was sort of interesting that given the history of photography and the ways that photography has been shown in institutional spaces, museums and galleries, which is to say, not a lot of Black folks, getting sort of that opportunity, that a younger generation working mostly at the beginning, outside of sort of institutional spaces such as magazines and museums and galleries, decided that they had something to say with that medium and use social media to largely publish their images. Because frankly, museums and galleries and magazines had locked out the generations before them. And I think that story of those photographers challenging the sort of status quo from the outside was one that was important to tell. And and so I did, and I think that that's the type of work that I am sort of committed to, and the type of work that makes me, extremely excited. And, in social works, it's an intergenerational conversation, right? It's not just sort of, one artist or artists from one particular generation or super young artists. It's a real sort of intergenerational sort of conversation around space and how definitions and concepts of space and community have changed, and our sort of ways that we envision ourselves within that space, within that community, has changed across generations. And so there is some tension, between, the generations. And I think that, like, if you put sort of an intergenerational mix of artists and their works in a gallery, what you're trying to do, at least I believe, is have a conversation across sort of the artist, but also across media, right? And so that's why you have painting and drawing and, you know, some figurative work, some abstraction, you have video installation, you have built environments, you have, you know, I think that for me is a way not to sort of flatten the way that Blackness sort of exists in the world, which is to say in extremely sort of dynamic and expressive ways. And so
Right.
that, for me, that's sort of at the root of what I'm, you know, trying to sort of do along by working with artists, or, you know, in my sort of writing when I'm sort of, you know, taking a step back and sort of examining what artists are doing. And so I think that's the thing that I'm after, and that's what drives me, is sort of this question of exchange and dialogue that occurs across Black communities.
But what's so beautiful about it is that it's unapologetically complex. And that's one thing that we're in a moment where the African American and African diaspora art markets are on fire. I mean, everybody knows that. It's like a serious market force going right now. But a lot of, to me at least, there's a whole sensibility where there's been, on one hand, this kind of reductionist essentialism, you know, where on the other hand, it's really critically important to show the complexity. And I think that is something that your show really brought home to roost on a lot of levels. And one thing I've always wanted to ask is, how often do you deal with Larry? I mean, he's kind of one of these generational characters. I really, let me know if I'm crossing any boundaries there. I'm very respectful, but I'm intrigued to see, because I would not normally view him as a political figure. I mean, I know during he's a really archetypal figure for New York for a long time. But I always was wondering, like, how does that all process? Do you like, how did this show, was there one conversation that you're like, yo, I want to do this show, I want to have this kind of vision, and how did the green light happen? You know, just out of curiosity, just a little backstory on that.
Larry is the owner of this gallery, obviously, and so as the owner of this gallery, who's been doing this far longer than I have, we have conversations about the shows. Everybody, all the, you know, directors and gallery have conversations about the shows. I mean, he's very involved. I think that, you know, we work collaboratively, and, you know, he's been extremely supportive. And I just want to sort of say, because a lot of people have been sort of curious about, you know, about Larry's role, is, you know, like, I don't know, to his credit, I don't know too many other gallerists that would do a show like this. And I think that if you look around and you think about the shows that they are doing, you'll see that it's not this type of show. And so I think, to Larry's credit, he was willing to sort of take the risk, and because he believes in, from every conversation I've had, and he believes in great art, you know, period. And so I think that is, you know, this is not to sort of go after anyone else, because it's, you know, it really isn't sort of the way that I even sort of think about. I mean, I really do operate from a spirit of community. But when you know, what's happening right now, I think more broadly, is that you're getting paintings that are overly figurative, and galleries are sort of extremely invested in that work. And you have to ask why. And so to have a show that isn't that, that sort of is willing to sort of deal with complexity, that is willing to sort of create a 60-ton sculpture from, you know, one of the great sort of architects of this generation, and to sort of supply the resources to allow that to happen, you know, to allow sort of a gallery that allows, you know, a farm to sort of be built into it, and sort of the maintenance that happens, you know, the course of that, it shows a real commitment. And I just want to say I appreciate that commitment. And had a lot of conversations, about why, why would I take a role, like this at this point in my career? It's about that. We all have to be sort of committed to this in a real way, in a way that's complex, in a way that allows, the same types of risks that white artists have been allowed to sort of take in these settings, for other artists, for women artists, or Black artists, or, for Latinx artists, for, Asian artists. We just need to make sure that the galleries are more, in general, are more reflective of the cities and societies that they operate in.
Right.
But
what's beautiful,
but it's also, it's not just, I almost would say this like more like broadly, because I know we're talking about galleries and museums, and that's fair, but that is a problem broadly. That's a problem in in almost every aspect of our culture, right? That it is not sort of thinking about the communities in which they operate, and the communities in which they sit in, like I'm always sort of blown away in some ways by the fact that you have cultural institutions, and I'm not just talking about museums or galleries or sort of the art world, but you have cultural institutions that sit in various communities, and they never think about how those communities, the people that live right there, walk past these institutions every day, benefit from them, or could benefit from them. And I think that is the sort of shift that needs to happen, writ large across the culture. It needs to happen on Broadway. It needs to happen in museums. It needs to happen in galleries. It needs to happen in Hollywood. It needs to it needs to happen in every part of our culture.
And what's beautiful about what you were just saying, and this is something, Antwaun, a lot of economists are now, there's a new term that many of them are kind of throwing around, which is we call cultural capital. And they're trying to differentiate between the financial mechanisms that have made late capitalism work. Art is one of these markets that's based on perception. So if you see a certain amount of Basquiat paintings, a certain amount of Picasso paintings, the value goes up because there's a scarcity in that market. On the other hand, with digital culture, everything's a copy, that you can have infinite copies. And I've always been intrigued with how painting and the more figurative arts that you were just talking about go for these narrow, very specific taste mechanisms that give them the financial mechanisms that work. But what you've done, I mean, with looking at food, with looking at architecture, with looking at all these kinds of hidden dimensions in both African American. It's not just specific to African American. It's like it's something that America itself needs to reevaluate how we can think of how do we look to the past to help us rethink the future. I mean, here we are in 2021, where it's the hottest summer in human history. Half the country's on fire. If you think about these massive fires going on in Siberia, the Amazon basin, et cetera, climate change, obviously the climate crisis is not just about just the physical aspect of people over consuming and producing carbon and the world was on fire, but it's about the mind and the way that people are not being given options to rethink their cultural space. And that's how deep I think your show is. I mean, it's really one of those moments where you can really, for lack of a better word, kind of dig into the texture of the everyday and then show how you can change it. To me, that was really a very life-affirming moment when I, checked out the material. So let's talk about the future. What are your next plans? This was a pretty monumental show. So what's next in the Antwaun archive? What's happening?
Like I'm working on several exhibitions. Sort of at the gallery and at some museums in the city. And yeah, I mean, I think it's about sort of continuing the work. I think it's about continuing to sort of engage with complex ideas and to see how you can present those, whether that's in, publication, whether that's, in the space of museum of a gallery. I think that like I love art and I'm extremely animated by it and by the possibilities of it. And I think that, this show was, a really great sort of introduction to the gallery. But I think making more shows that sort of continues to sort of think about other ideas within sort of Black communities is deeply important to me. And so I'm just, very, very, very committed to that. And, I'm really glad that this show has, had such a resonance, but I also think that it's about sort of continuing and not really sort of slowing down in any sort of way. I think that, there'll be projects with some of the artists in this exhibition that sort of come out of this exhibition that the gallery's committed to. And then there'll be, other sort of, projects that happen outside the gallery that sort of engage, aspects of fashion, aspects of sort of other interests that I have. I think that that's important. I think to stay sort of culturally involved with all the interests that I have, it's just super important and just keeps me sort of, animated and going. So I'm really excited about those upcoming projects. To continue.
Is there any specific one that's like in the pipeline for autumn, for example? I'm just because I'm very curious to hear, like, because what you just described was a little bit more broad. Is there more specific stuff, like what's happening, say for example September, October, anything coming up?
October I'm opening a show. I'm opening a show in London at our gallery in London that I've been working on. And so, we continue, I think it's and I think that's the sort of beauty of being at the gallery and having really great, colleagues from around the world, is that, you can really sort of get into a really great exchange of ideas that leads to tangible exhibitions and tangible conversations with artists that really sort of allows them to sort of be invited into the gallery to sort of make those conversations public through the artwork that they are presenting. So, me and my colleagues at the gallery have just been totally engaged in some really great conversations, and the first sort of iterations of those conversations will happen in London, opening during Freeze, and then we'll just sort of keep on going.
Okay. And anything with fashion, perhaps? I mean, I was just curious because the book, I almost feel like that's part one. I want to see part two. Like, there's so many new evolutions and developments. That's where I was kind of like,
yeah, I mean, but I think I should also say that I have a real, outside of the sort of museum and or the sort of gallery work that I do, I also have a part of my practice is this sort of idea of like fascination with sort of fashion and sort of the ways that identity and beauty is sort of communicated through sort of dress and appearance, and so like I still sort of I consult for Nike, for example, and I have for Calvin Klein, a lot of these sort of conversations over the last several campaigns. I've had all of the conversations with every photographer that they've used for their campaigns, and then those conversations sort of come out and live on sort of through Calvin's sort of universe. I have a great relationship with Gucci. I just sort of wrote a exhibition text about sort of advertising and sort of the changing sort of modes of advertising through the sort of lens of the last 6 years of Alessandro Michele being there. That that is being published in a book that the Gucci's doing, and so I think that like, and then also it's I'm just finishing a text for a museum catalog. There's a text I just wrote that came out about Yinka Shirabari's engagement with fashion. He has a show right now, a retrospective at the Salzburg Museum. And so I think that like the fashion stuff sort of continues in the various ways, but I also but it's all sort of, for me, again, just a part of a practice that allows for me to really just explore these questions that I'm sort of attracted to around artistic production, but also around the sort of identity and cultural politics that really shape our realities.
Right. So one of the things that really kind of intrigues me, and this is something where I like, did your family have an arts backdrop? That's one of the, I mean, sorry to go back to the biographical, but because like this doesn't, you don't come out of nowhere. I mean, I'm very intrigued. The Chicago backdrop, whether it be Obama or Theaster Gay, there's a whole cultural mix that I think allowed someone like you, it's very unique. I mean, you're once in a generation kind of figure here. I mean, I'm not saying that lightly either, but it's like, who, like father, mother, like what was your backdrop on that? Like, sorry, did you mind jumping into the biographical a little bit?
Oh, I don't. I mean, I think I shared it. The parents are not in art. I think that I just grew up in a household that was, really sort of open. My, parents do not have I have no artist in my family at all. And, but there were things, you bring up Theaster, and, I remember being like 16 and like Theaster would be like playing different, this is long before sort of, his sort of meteoric rise, sort of in the art world, he would just be like playing shows, music shows. And, I would like drop by them and, he was sort of a local figure, you talk about Obama, like I remember like being 15, reading the Chicago Reader and like trying to sort of, there was a lot when he was running first for Senate, there were like so many candidates. And I was like, well, which one of them was like, didn't support the Iraq War, which was really important to me at the time. And he was the only one in that race. And so I just like dropped by his like, his campaign office and they were like, here, kid, take these and pass out this, literature. And I just did for them, like, I think it was just like Chicago at that time. It's a big city with a lot of possibility. And I think I really love sort of growing up there and having, and just being able to try things, and being, from a family that allowed that, and being a part of community that really sort of reinforced that, but no, and in sort of the short, like I don't have, family members who or artists or have any sort of real connection to the art world, which I think is really sort of fine. And I think that we might want to encourage more of that, like I think that if art is really about everybody and about sort of attracting the widest publics possible, then you need folks in that space that are representing those publics, and so I, am really, my family are very supportive but they don't have sort of that sort of background, so that's been also really cool to sort of bring them along in that way as well, and expose them to things that maybe they wouldn't otherwise been exposed to.
No, it's really beautiful. And the beauty of what you were just talking about, like coming out of the situation in Chicago, DC had also a very specific African-American middle class backdrop. And it was really a pleasure to see, the evolution of how you were coming out of these things. So today,
I also want to say I was born in like the Cabrini Green housing project. So like this was not middle class at all. I think that like, I also think that is one of the sort of, sort of not misconceptions, but that's, I think one of the things is that, there was a lot of folks who, despite whatever, the background or socioeconomic status, that sort of gave me an opportunity to really be curious as a kid and sort of reinforce that curiosity. And I think that was just really important to me. And so like the first job that I ever had, I've had two jobs. I was a kindergarten teacher. I did Teach for America. I was a kindergarten teacher in East New York, Brooklyn. And so I was teaching kindergarten and writing about art at night. And then the other job is this one, and then in between, I was just a freelance sort of, creative or whatever, and it was just really important because I remember just sort of distinctly having my curiosity reinforced. And I just thought like the thing that I could do first was to sort of give back in a very tangible way teaching 4 and 5-year-olds in East New York, Brooklyn, how to read for basically 4 years. And then, I was sort of like do that by day. And then at night, I would go to artist studios and go to openings and then, write and pitch stories. And, it was a really sort of, that's how I came up, like in the city, just sort of hustling in that way, and there was, no sort of parent that was, there was no sort of money in that way, like,
Okay.
Oh, you can, go and work some sort of, job that doesn't pay well. It's like I had to sort of put a lot of different things together to sort of do this work. And that's, how I learned. My education was like in artist studios, at museums, asking questions and just being around folks that really sort of encouraged that questioning and were open and welcoming, like, and I think about artists, I think about sort of artists like Mick Thomas. I think about, curators like Thelma Golden. I think about, folks like Lynn Ligon, who are just like, just encouraging and giving, you need opportunities to grow. And those folks were very encouraging in that growth, whether it was like me wanting to like, ask them a trillion questions about things, or I remember very distinctly early on, like Mick gave me my first opportunity really to sort of write a catalog essay for a big artist, and she just sort of emailed me and it's like, and then that would allow for growth. I think that as someone who's 32 in this position at the gallery, like what Larry has, sort of, allowed me to do is allowing for a different type of growth. And I think I'm just really sort of grateful that I, as a sort of a still relatively young person, are having these opportunities to not only sort of present ideas, but also grow in those ideas, through the sort of platforms that have been allowed to me. And I think that that's also important, like I don't think that I want to be someone that's like, he's like some sort of, like exception or whatever. It's like I was just given opportunities to be curious, have that have that curiosity reinforced, and to now I'll being allowed to in a different way continue that work. And the gallery, to its credit, is standing behind that, and I really sort of appreciate that. Which is not like sort of the other work I've done, like I'm working on a show right now at the Brooklyn Museum, and Anne and sort of the curatorial team there have also been very helpful, but also really great, and give me a platform to sort of do a sort of major museum exhibition, which was supposed to open, I should say, it was supposed to open right when COVID hit, but things get scrambled. And so, this was long before, sort of my relationship to the gallery or anything like that. And I just say that to say that, like, that chance that was being taken on me by Anne and her, curatorial team at the museum was before any of all of this, and so I've just had folks who have really sort of have given me the opportunity to sort of make exhibitions and make books and make sort of these connections and conversations about art in ways that I am just personally grateful for, and I think needs to be extended out to other folks, and I think that's one of the things that is really sort of important to me, even if you think about me editing the last issue of Art in America, right? What my approach to that was I want to work with, it was a series of young Black critics, because you look across the landscape and you're not sort of seeing those voices, in sort of on, in any sort of frequency in art publications, right? Talking and discussing art, right? The critic, as we sort of come to define it, is a overwhelmingly sort of white male voice, right? And so I wanted to make sure that in that project, again, this sense of community, I invited writers who could hold the space with me and discuss the art that they wanted to discuss, and write the sort of critical pieces they wanted to, right? And I think that like, for me, it's about creating opportunity and creating space whenever, sort of a project sort of comes to me, because I really do think that there's something really important and powerful about working from the space of community.
No, it's hard to describe, but what you were just describing is like you had a very compelling and supportive group of people. There was a window of opportunity that you then, how should I put it? Every crisis is an opportunity. I personally feel we're in a crisis of representation. We're in a crisis of not only how people rethink. The right wing right now has been using Black culture as a boogeyman, like Antifa or BLM. If you think about the Trump demographic, it's been a really intriguing, critical moment in democracy. But because of the complexity and the sheer generosity, and also just, I think there's a really compelling moment of empathy in the way that you've been creating and curating and building bridges between different scenes and people. I want to be respectful of time, because I remember you said 2 p.m. was your cutoff point. So just out of respect for the time, I want to make sure to open up to audience, because there's some great people in the audience who I think might have some great questions for you. Nick and Brooklyn Rail crew, how do you guys want to moderate? Or just people don't go crazy and like start bombarding with questions or anything, but like Antwaun, it's really refreshing. And I have to admit, today, by the way, is the anniversary of the 76th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, where the US dropped a nuclear bomb, the first time a nuclear weapon was used. And amusingly enough, a lot of the plutonium and uranium that was stored for what they call the Manhattan Project was stored right around the corner from Gagosian Gallery. I always chuckle about that, because if you walk through Chelsea with the Geiger counter, you'll notice some radiation. But long story short, I do want to just say it's a beautiful moment to kind of rethink these legacies and histories and the complexity of our time. And the exhibition, for the audience, if you haven't seen it, it's some great people. And Antwaun, thank you for making the time.
The exhibition is up through September 11th. Right now we're on a gallery hour, so until Labor Day, it's Monday to Friday, 10 to 6, and then after Labor Day, it's the Tuesday to Saturday normal sort of gallery hours from 10 to 6. So please pop in and experience the exhibition.
So questions, Nick,
Yes.
Fawn, how do you guys want to do this?
So I'm happy to take the mic here, and I want to thank you both, Antwaun and Paul. Congrats, Antwaun, on this exhibition. We'll post the link in the chat for those that can make it, and we do encourage everyone to go check out this amazing show. But keeping time tight, I am going to pass the mic over for our first question to our friend G.E. Schwartz. So G.E., you should be able to turn your mic on.
Thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to seeing this show. I'm going to try and get down there very, very soon. The question is, and it's a general question, but it seems like we can maybe tease out some things here to be very, very valuable. How can we use the real to change, to disrupt the ideal? And I'm thinking of that, especially in the way you seem to be so wonderfully working with the various intersections of art, culture, even corporate, to get the thing done.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for your question. I really appreciate it. I mean, I just sort of briefly, I mean, I think that for me, one of the things that I'm sort of after is not necessarily a one thing, right? I'm not sort of looking for like one, illustration of community or one illustration of identity or one illustration of beauty. I think that, there is no ideal as I see it. And I think that if you put enough voices together, that who have their own conceptions, about all of these things, then I think you're allowed to at least sort of present those sort of varying perspectives. And I think that's, for me, it's about sort of, I think, my whole thing is about, presentation, right? Like sort of the presenting of ideas, and you sort of grapple with them and take from what you will, but it really is about sort of allowing for the opportunity for not just one sort of set of ideas to sort of happen in a space, because I think for far too long, that's been the case, right? And that's where we sort of get into this idea that this false notion that there are ideals, or that there are, a particular standard around beauty or identity, or painting, or what have you, right? And so I think that you have to just keep on pushing against those sort of notions of ideas, or sort of trying to simplify the culture, right? Or over sort of expression of, you know, sort of representation or, you know, in like figurative representation, for example, in painting, you know, like, I think that like for a very long time, there were other conversations happening that we've just not valued. And so I go, you know, why not sort of, you know, do something where you're having all the conversations, right, around the sort of figurative impulse, but also abstraction about then also those artists who are sort of working in between, and, you know, and sort of really sort of try to get sort of to a place where there's a real sort of overview of what's happening in that space, opposed to something that is just solely market driven, right? And I think that is, or market driven, but I also think the museums have also, you know, played a very sort of big role in sort of this emphasis on figuration because of the lack of Blackness and the complexity of that Blackness in their sort of institutional holdings, right? And so the simplest approach is to sort of have a Black figure in that space as some sort of representation of, say, our museums or galleries, you know, social and moral commitments. And I don't know if that's what we need. You know, I think that what we need is sort of there's been, you know, a real sort of engagement with the ideas from, you know, diverse peoples, and not necessarily just their bodies, right? And so I just use the painting framework as an example,
Right.
but that's sort of how I'm sort of thinking about it, is that, like, you know, not all representation obviously is good representation, and how do you show that in a very, very diverse way that doesn't necessarily, you know, you know, like it doesn't have to always just sort of begin and end with the artist. And frankly, it shouldn't, right?
Right.
You should be thinking
Absolutely.
about sort of not even just curators, but you should also be thinking about sort of, you know, the architecture. You should think about sort of the experience of the scenography, how do you walk through a space, right? I think there's a lot of different ways that you can sort of be thinking about these questions of getting at, you know, sort of real and sort of getting at sort of a multiplicity of experience than just sort of relying sort of lazily on a painting or on something that is so sort of figurative or so sort of like that is so sort of like, look, see, this is a Black person did this thing that really sort of, I think, helps not everybody in that situation, sort of really sort of the audiences, the maker, the institution, sort of to sort of get at sort of more complicated and nuanced aspects of presentation, really, and this sort of idea of between the real and the ideal, you know.
So you're orchestrating like a chorus of stuff then, right?
Yeah, I always think about like well, that's why I'm also sort of always interested in working across all these things like fashion and art and writing and curating and, you know, all of it, because I think it's just like, it's about sort of like bringing that sensibility in all of these different things, because also culture isn't like sort of happening in vacuums, right? Like I know so many like artists, like meaning like, you know, traditional sort of like painters and, you know, those sort of artists who are like in conversation with, you know, architects and fashion designers and musicians and all these folks. And I go, you know, I think that sort of just creates a more dynamic engagement.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
So just to be respectful of his time, I mean, Antwaun, you did say 2 o'clock. So if anybody, it's 1:56, so we can maybe take a couple more questions. Just want to keep it tight because everyone will respect your time. If you can go maybe 5. Yeah, but Nick, do you want anybody else? Anybody?
We do. We did get a good question from Jen in the audience. Jen, I'm going to pass the mic over to you.
Hi, Antwaun. Thank you so much. So I oversee the education department at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and we are we're so excited to have your show come this spring. But my question, something I didn't know about you, is that you were a kindergarten teacher. So as a museum educator, you know, I'm super excited to hear that. And I'm curious if there's any lessons that you carry forth. You know, I think teaching really young people helps us understand kind of how to break things down. So I'm curious if there's anything from that experience that you carry with you as you think about presenting art to a public who may or may not be familiar with art history. I'm just curious about that connection and that
Yeah,
part of
no,
your
I mean,
reality.
I think that two things that I sort of carried forward. I'm also really happy that the show is going to the Cleveland Museum. The new Black Vanguard will be on view there next spring. You know, I think that the one sort of overarching sort of thing that you learn when you're working with like 4 and 5-year-olds, it's like, don't underestimate their intelligence or the experience that they bring to school in that case. And I've sort of taken that to sort of also think about sort of the engagement with sort of the different publics that come into a museum, right? I don't think anyone at any age, no one wants to be condescended, no one wants to be sort of condescended to, right? And so I sort of take that and I sort of think about sort of that in sort of the way that we sort of position sort of art and the way that we sort of challenge. It's, I think part of it is also about challenging audiences, right? And giving the context for that sort of, that engagement to happen. But, you want to make sure that it's always a balance between respecting sort of folks' intelligence, but then also saying, this is the sort of engagement I hope happens when you stand before this work, or when you walk through this work, when you see this work, right? But also not being overly sort of didactic or prescriptive to no one, so the exchange doesn't happen, right? And so I think it's about, for me, about trying to find that balance, and also in a gallery, what's sort of interesting is there's very little, galleries are not museums, by design, obviously. And so there's very little text that actually happens in galleries generally. And so, as a sort of response to that, I go, sure, let's keep that, aspect. But then what we created was a zine, right? With all the artists, and sort of, we had conversations, and I had a conversation with David Adjay, Theaster Gates, and his team at Rebuild in Chicago, annotated the Frankie Knuckles archive. And then Linda Goodbrien had this really dynamic conversation about food justice with the chef Devon Francis. I mean, it was just this really sort of, it was a way to bring in a lot of different other people into the exhibition, but also a way for the artists to sort of think about and share the why they were making their work without being sort of like, this is what it is, this is what you should get from it. They're like sort of opening up the space for it not to be like a right and a wrong in terms of like, viewing art and sort of having a relationship to art, because I think that's one of the great barriers, I think, for a lot of publics, is that there's this idea that like, you have to come in with this sort of level of experience, and not all experience is sort of valued. And I really sort of, try to make sure everyone to know that everyone's sort of welcomed, and everyone and sort of everyone is welcome, because there's some aspect of the exhibition that should appeal to, different sort of publics and different sensibilities. And so that's what I'm always sort of trying to do, sort of trying to find that balance between respecting folks' intelligence and the sort of knowledges that they bring to the sort of space, but then also providing sort of an engagement or a challenge in the exhibition itself. And I think that I totally learned that from my kindergarten classes, because you would just be so blown away by the connections that the students would make to sort of make meaning, right? And sort of trying to sort of, figure out how to sort of approach it from the ways in which they see the world, is just vitally important. Because I think in a lot of ways, museum practice has been about the artist's point of view or the curator's point of view. And I think adding in sort of the public's point of view in a real way, not just sort of playing sort of platitudes to, this is, this museum is open and it's free and it's all of these things. But then, I always like to say that on free days, the people that would have paid just, come for free, and so it's like really about like, how do you like actually have a commitment to that community? And sometimes it's about going to the communities themselves, right? Leaving the building, the sort of institution, and bringing the institution in some way, shape, or form to the communities that you want to be engaged in, right? And so I hope to see more of that. I think there's a good example in the Underground Museum where you have MoCA sort of lending aspects of a collection to that institution that is sort of community rooted in community and inside, sort of a sort of a POC community in Los Angeles. I think that there could be more dynamic interactions, even, at the gallery, I have ideas around sort of like, oh, there's certain artists that we work with that work within certain communities. Why not stage exhibitions, a gallery level exhibition in that community? It doesn't always have to happen in the gallery, right? And so I think that it's still sort of trying to work on, sort of expand our notions of what institutions can do and how they can sort of serve the publics that they say in their mission statements that they are here to serve.
Well, and with that note, I mean, Antwaun, it's such a very life affirming thing that it's really, these are very cynical times. And obviously, given the pandemic and the impact on the creative arts, many artists and musicians and creatives in general have really suffered during the last year. I just want to say it's really a refreshing thing to see the city become alive again with shows like yours. So it's been, it's been everybody out there has probably had some ups and downs in the last year. Just want to be respectful of time. Do we have, Phong, you want to do a closing thing, or how, Antwaun, how's your time? Because it's 2:03. Are you cool?
Yeah,
Maybe
we're going to, there's going to be a closing. A really great poet's going to join us, and I'll definitely stick around for that. I can't wait to hear.
Okay, just want to make sure, just time. Sorry to keep focusing on time, but I'm just, so Nick, Phong, how you guys want to do the poets?
I'd be happy to, mention a little bit what Anton has said earlier. Answer the question from GE, and also following what Jen has said. In thinking about art and fashion, it's been a tradition, very strong, that we can't really forget, Coco Chanel and Jean Cocteau and also even Marc Jacobs and Rachel Feinstein and many other people today. But I'm glad that you can overlap and be freely flowing between the two. But thinking about Chicago, where you came from, and also thinking about having taught kindergarten also in your career, Anton, I can't help but the whole tradition of Chicago school of, social philosophy and whatnot. I mean, we can't help but think, because I'm right now beginning to reread the revised version of Thomas Sowell, A Conflict of Visions, which he spoke a great deal about, of course, the clash between constrained and the unconstrained vision. And most of us tend to think he's a libertarian, which he admits occasionally at times, but otherwise he's a very prominent Black conservative thinker, very much under the same school with Milton Friedman and Stigler. I think Stigler might have been his teacher at University of Chicago, but really really doesn't want to be, in a way, pigeonholed in any other way. In other words, even recently, Morgan Freeman, who is one of his admirers, make comment like, I do not want to support the idea of Black History Month. Why don't Jewish people have Jewish History Month? Or the white people do, or whoever else, So on that note, I can't help but to think also of the broadness of Glisson's famous demand, the famous phrase, the right to opacity. I'm thinking of that particularly because I've been seeing a lot of friends, but in thinking of just a few prominent artists from Chicago, just to give example, Martin Puryear, who really dedicated his entire life as an abstract sculptor. Although I must say the recent work in the last Venice Biennale, there's some prominent glimpse of figuration, definitely. But opposite of Martin is Kerry James Marshall, very much a figurative artist. So in your show, Anton, I thought it was very wonderfully juxtaposed, because you walk in the first room, you got Titus Kaphar, your figurative artist, and then you look in the other opposite space, on the other side of the gallery, is Nick Lowe. Just the same way that you pair wonderful in the big show, you know, the big space with Theaster and David Adjay, you know, so there are a few examples like that. And I can't think, I mean, it's very important for me now thinking of the school Chicago, which go way back, Jen, to John Dewey. So Dewey teaching in his famous book, Democracy and Education, he never tried to distinguish the teaching between, let's say, vocational training as opposed to scholarly, you know, scholarship or being academic training. There's no separation. So that said, my question is very simple, Antwaun. To me, curation is almost being a conductor of a symphony, so to speak. So that's an idea you have. How are you going to orchestrate all this instrument, musician playing to create that symphonic sound, the whole totality of sound. But at the same time, there's also the sense of space, right? My grandmother once said, if you live in a long tube, be thin. If you live in a barrel, be round. So my question is that you all, as a conductor, as a curator, you have to start with 1 or 2 or 3 key works. That doesn't mean that it's more important than the other work that will be subordinating those 2, 3 works. So my question is this, when you start doing this show, what were those key works that you want to anchor into this very show?
So many of the works were commissioned for this exhibition. And so it wasn't necessarily about key works as it were about key artists. And I think that the way that I sort of started was, I knew that it was important to have Linda Good-Bryant, because in a lot of ways, I think that her contribution is just vitally important. And I knew that Rick Lowe was vitally important, giving sort of Project Row Houses and sort of the way he really sort of set a model, right, for artists who are in the show and artists who are outside the show, you know, of this sort of socially engaged community practice, right? And then I also thought that it was really important to have Theaster, because of the way that he was, I mean, the way that he thinks about the archive as space, right? And I also thought it was really important to have, I think it was like 5 or 6 people. I was like, I need to sort of get these folks, and then everything else would fall into place. Titus and then Carrie Mae Weems were both just very, very important. And then with Carrie Mae Weems, I knew the works that those works were sort of, that room of works were so vitally important to this idea. And so, and then with other art, you know, I just had conversations though. I didn't, you know, I think that like for me, and I know at the gallery, it really is an artist-led sort of institution. And so, you know, as you all know, sort of knowing artists, you can sort of want whatever you want, but, you know, when you sort of start to sort of have conversations, new ideas come up. And you know, and I think that, you know, one of the things, as, you know, you said, is that it's to sort of be able to sort of work in this sort of flow that allows for sort of, you know, these conversations to sort of, you know, and there's conversations that sort of started with this exhibition that will sort of, that for whatever reason needed more time, or this wasn't sort of the right sort of space for it, that will continue and hopefully be shown later at, you know, in the sort of appropriate context, you know, like in that, you know, spirit of the saying from your grandmother, you know, that you have to sort of make sure the space is right, and that you're responding to the space appropriately, right? At least that's what I got from her saying. And so, yeah, so I think those were the artists that I was really sort of like thinking about, you know, even, I mean, one sort of quick story is that with David Adjay, you know, my sort of initial idea with David was, oh, it'd be really great if David designed the exhibition, right? And then we sort of kept talking, and I kept sort of talking to the artists and getting a sense of what they wanted to do and being in dialogue. And then I just, one day, it just sort of occurred to me that they have all spatial practices, as you can sort of walk through the exhibition and see, and they have really sort of particular ways in which they want to engage space, opposed to sort of impose sort of a David design on them. how about we give David an opportunity to respond to this space in which he, in his own right, as someone who's probably the sort of greatest, architect of his generation, and I say that not as sort of a, hyperbole or because he's in the show, but just given the type of work he has done and the way he's thinking and his work with artists. I have always thought him as an artist architect, thinking about his sort of his engagements with Chris O'Feely, the way that he sort of thinks about sort of material and communities when he thinks about sort of and symbolism within his architecture. If you think about sort of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, right? And you think about the Corona, right? And how that sort of thinks about sort of not only certain sort of African sort of practices, right? Production practices, but also thinks about the American South, right? I think that that is an artistic move within architecture, right? And so I'm just, so some conversations were at the very beginning, very sort of, we're having these conversations, and then, a bit later, it helped me to revise my thinking and sort of go back to artists and go, I know we're talking about this, or I know we're thinking about this. That conversation we should keep having. We should keep having those conversations and sort of thinking through the work in that way. But I also think that you said this one thing that got me thinking about this other sort of possibility. What do you think about that? And then we'll talk about it. They'll take a few days, then we'll come back again, we'll talk some more, and then we'll sort of get to sort of arrive at a commission for this particular show. It was really sort of organic, which was a really great way to sort of work with the artist.
No, I think it's a very open possibility for it to demand different kind of reading. That's exactly what a good show would compel to do. But I also, I as I were going through the whole entirety of the show, coming away with my assistant Cal, and I was thinking, I wonder if Antwaun would consider if the next round of the similar theme, would you consider people like David Hammond, whose social commitment is subtle? We know that, Antwaun, because I don't think that without his support gathering of the tribe would ever be possible. What he supported our beloved friend, the late poet Steve Cannon, for example, so that is a different kind of social activity that is not explicitly visible, not like Titus with Nick and Haven and all the Theaster and our friend others. So that's my sort of thinking about it, Antwaun. So it's really open, the show. It kept me thinking about variety of way. And I'm just happy that in correspondence to your show, Helen Mosewood also did that beautiful show up in Jack Salmon, the school, where a lot of artists in your show also have appeared in her show. So I think
there's Lauren Halsey is the crossover, I think, between the shows, but that show is also really, really beautiful. And also I just want to point out David Hammond's who came to the exhibition, and I was sort of shocked that he came to the exhibition, who was in the gallery. He's in Linda Good Bryan's video. If you in that video work, Linda and David have a friendship of 40 years and a really close collaboration. And there's this really poetic scene of Linda and David in his studio where he's sort of doing these little sort of performances, right? And one of which he sets up a series of saltine crackers and a little boxer action figure.
Yeah.
And the funny sort of position is it's like Muhammad Ali fighting these crackers, right? That's the sort of and so he's doing these sort of little experiments in the funny sort of very David Hammond's sort of experience where he's operating on all these different levels. And so I would listen. If David Hammond wants to do an exhibition at Gagosian Gallery, sign me up. I think that we would welcome that. I would welcome that. And, but he is in the exhibition in that way, right? And I think the way that you talk about the openness is that there are several scenes of, of him and Linda engaged in acts of community, right? Where he's sort of talking about his life and she's talking about her life. And there's these artworks happening and being created and being explored in his studio, right? And so that adds another dimension to this sort of idea of the social.
Well, I find it super pleasurable to see David in the video, and also in the wounds retrospective of the Whitney. So he's one of those subliminal, very elusive character since day one, and he still is today. So, anyway,
by the way, I wanted to say it's been an absolute pleasure hearing both of you guys riff on David, and just by way of time, because it's 2:18, and Antwaun, I remember you mentioned you got to make a phone call or some other things. Do we want to roll into the poetry moment? Like, is this a good point of view for that? And Antwaun,
thank you, Paul.
You guys, this has just been so life affirming. I have to admit, man, every day you wake up and the news is like, this fucking virus or Trump or some other shit. And anyway, just it's very heartwarming to me. And Antwaun, I'm just happy that we made the time. Thank you. Nick, poet, crew,
yes.
Everybody.
Yes,
right.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Antwaun. Thank you for joining us today and for your beautiful responses and for your generosity. But we do have a tradition here at the Rail with ending our community events with a poetry reading. I am very pleased to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Lucía Hinojosa Gaxiola, to the stage. Quickly to introduce Lucía. Lucía is a interdisciplinary artist and writer. Lucía's time-based practice develops through ephemeral gestures that result in a corpus of text-based visual and sound pieces. She's the artistic director of Disonare, an experimental editorial project from Mexico City, and her upcoming book from Tender Buttons Press, The Telaraña Circuit, is forthcoming later this year. Without further ado, Lucía, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much for this invitation, and thanks Antwaun and Paul and Fongster as always, and Nick for putting these things together. I'll just jump into the poems because I know we have a time thing, and I selected some poems while the conversation was going on. Just picking out things about how I resonated with all this wonderful conversation and these important things that we must address. And Fong mentioned glissant, and I just wanted to mention this little phrase that I remembered from glissant that will be part of my book as well, that it says relationality is made up of all the differences of the world. So just to invoke that phrase, I will start. Anatomical blue, meridians as axes, map the woman you carry inside your lungs. Every time you breathe, they bow down to their knees, praying for cosmographical friction. Keep mining the hidden elements of things. Populations ascend in the act of blinking. What is place? Where is place? Who, what makes place? How, why are you place? As I write and think in the lead coming out of my pen, over the surface, always possible, always impossible of this blank paper, I think we can perpetually become, and there is no debt between a theoretical body, a sensuous body, a technocrat's body, the body of a dead animal on the highway, a disillusioned body in crisis, the body that can always be refuted. The body that cries, the forgotten body of someone else's, the body of water that we hold is fragmented in the illusion of nation, madre, patria, border, border, border. Border is an interactive mask. What is a body but a politics of location? Politics is not a discourse you can hold. It is not even language, but more like an insect traveling your pineal gland and moving your peripheries, dissolving the visible dimension of consciousness like an act of migration, like a scale of realities reacting to each other and moving all your forces, coming alive in the impossibility to voice a tongue, a migrating tongue, like the apparition of an organ or the elements morphing into fire, air, water, ether, earth. Your tongue still moving the absence of a desert grain. Negative spaces open the thread. Like a canceled monument, your nomadic insect touches this corpse. What is a body but a drift that has to be voiced? And this is the last poem. It's a sound poem on migrations and geopolitical borders, but also semantic borders. Furtive, fertile, fertile, furtive, furtive, frontier, tier, front, font, for, feud, futile, fiction, fertile, fiction, for front, in front, fugitive, tier, front, for, tiv, fugitive, for font, futile, fiction, fertile, fertile, furtive, futile, fiction, fertile, fertile, fiction, fertile, action, action, fertile, action, 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 fertile, action. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
Thank you so much.
Lucia. Yes, I thank you for sharing new poems with us. What an honor to be able to hear those today. I want to once more just thank you so much, Antwaun. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Lucia, and for everyone that asked a question, for everyone that joined. We do this every single day at 1 p.m. So join us on Monday for a conversation between Joyce Kozloff and Anne McCoy. We'll conclude with a poetry reading from PJ Lombardo. But I wish you all a great weekend, and you can all turn on your microphones now to say hello.
Wait, hold on 1 second. Before we do that, I just want to say I've sent some links about his recent book and the fact that he edited the last issue of Art in America. So if you guys see those links in the description, you'll see there. And Fong is saying, oh, social works. Yeah, it's just some great stuff, man. If you haven't seen it, you got to see it. It'll make have a better day. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Thank
Antwaun.
Thank you so much.
It was great.
Thank you, Lucia.
Thank you so much.
Antwaun.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great talk.
Guys,
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Antoine.
thank you, Paul. Thank you, Antoine.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Lucia. Thank you so much.
Woo!
Thanks, PE.
Thank you. Nice to see you more.